most of the world, like yourselves and even me to a certain extent, are moving around and they're asked, who are you? When you move to another culture, the top level are what one could call culture and cultural rules, summarized in when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So when in England, drive on the left-hand side of the road, pay your taxes, pretend to love cricket and football, whatever. Play by the cultural rules, learn the sense of humor of the English and so on. All the stuff you take in the tests when you become a British citizen, remember who Shakespeare is or whatever. So you learn a set of rules which you have to learn throughout your life to play the game in the situation you are in, whether a school or country.
The Inspire Us podcast.
This question about identity is an interesting one. And you mentioned you had come up with this, was it 4-pillar idea? Because it is interesting and it's something I've come across and Dara's come across. People ask you, who are you or where are you from? And then you'll say, oh, I'm from this place. And I've traveled a lot, so it's like, oh, I'm from this place, but do I associate with this place if I've never really been there? And some people will say, oh, well, you're not from there because your blood is from here. So it becomes quite a complicated thing. And I think even in relation to individualism, we can get lost, or maybe we can find our identity in what we do and who we build to be as individuals. So maybe could you share with us what you think and what is this 4-pillar idea of identity?
Right. Well, whenever I say 4 pillars, I can only ever remember 1 or 2 of them. But 4 levels is better. So most of the world, like yourselves and even me to a certain extent, are moving around and they're asked, who are you? So when you move to another culture, the top level are what one could call culture and cultural rules, summarized in when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So when in England, drive on the left-hand side of the road, pay your taxes, pretend to love cricket and football, whatever. Play by the cultural rules, learn the sense of humor of the English and so on. All the stuff you take in the tests when you become a British citizen, remember who Shakespeare is or whatever. So you learn a set of rules which you have to learn throughout your life to play the game in the situation you are in, whether a school or country. And those cultural rules you can almost write them down, and they're not too difficult. And many cultures or peoples who come to England or go to another country find it, it takes a year or 2 to learn these cultural rules, and then you're a good player on that cultural. Another level is where the deepest level is where you your character. Well, a middling level is your identity. In other words, if someone says, who are you? You say, I am British, I am whatever it is. Now that's more flexible. And I'll give you a nice example that I came across recently of a young Chinese friend of mine. He's 10, and he was born and brought up in this country but he goes back to China frequently, and he speaks Chinese at home, but he's at a British boarding school and so on. When I ask him, when he's in Cambridge, where he lives, who are you? What's your nationality or nation or whatever? He says British, of course. Then I went on a flight back to China with him, and Air China, the hostesses are Chinese, the food is Chinese, the music is Chinese. I asked him, who you are, James. He said, I'm Chinese. So it you're British here, you're Nigerian in Nigeria. So that's a second level. There's one I can't remember, but the third is one that interested me recently. The place I worked in the Himalayas in Nepal was right up on the Annapurna Mountains. And the people there, who I still know and visit sometimes, they have a particular character, which I enormously admire. They were recruited into the British Gurkhas there and fought for the British because the British noticed that they were excellent soldiers because very honest, very truthful, very direct, good sense of humour, good sportsmen, very loyal, hardworking, tough, all good characters, very gentle with each other, no caste system, very egalitarian between males and females. So they were a perfect group of people to recruit into your armies. And that's what I found when I went to this village. Now, these villagers in the late 1960s onwards, almost all of them have left the village. They've gone down into local cities like Kathmandu, gone off to Hong Kong, gone to Singapore. Many of them live in North London, Brent Cross area. And I go to see them. And when I go there and I watch the families whose children have been born in this country and go to English schools and so on, they know all the cultural identities. They may never have been back to their village or speak any other language. So if you ask them who they are, they would probably say British. But in certain contexts, they will say Gurung, which is the group. But when you look at their character, the thing that is instilled in you in the first 1 or 2 years of your life by watching your parents interact and your family interact at a very deep level, how they treat women, how they treat elder people, postures and gestures, everything. When you look at that among second, third generation Gurungs, they are still the people I met in that village 50, 60 years ago, because that has been passed on, their psychology and character and their social relationships. And I think that's a very helpful thing, that this goes on for 3 or 4 generations, because it comes at a stage before you're socialized into the wider society or go to school or anything like that. So you are Nigerian at the level of your character, and you are French, Tunisian at the level of your character, but you have got these levels on top of it. So that was the theory I've been thinking about.
Mm. It's interesting. And do you think there are levels, or the importance of levels switches based on where you're from? Like, will the level of your character be more important if you're English compared to if you're in Nepal? And also, I want to mention, I've also had this where if I'm in France, I will say I'm French. If I go to Tunisia, I'll say, yeah, I'm Tunisian. I hadn't thought about that it's switching, and it feels normal in the context when you're there.
Well, this is what I was saying James does. When he's in Britain, he says he's Chinese. And when he, on Air China, he says he's Chinese. British and Chinese. Yes, you switch, you adapt to it. Most of what I learn about the world now is sitting in the back of taxis, which I've given up my car. And so the taxis in Cambridge are driven by people from all over the world, particularly from the Middle East, Pakistan, East Europe. And nearly always you have this moment, and it's clear that this person is not a native Englishman. What do you say to them? You say, where are you from, whatever. Because if you don't put it rightly, it can sound very arrogant, but you want to have a conversation about their experience and the differences. And if you say, where did your parents come from, or something like that, then it's fairly neutral. And so when someone asks you, where are you from, I would be inclined to say, well, what do you mean, where am I from? Do you mean where my parents are from? Do you mean where I was born, where I've lived mostly? What are you asking about? And then they say, well, yes, I'd like to know about your family background, or I'd like to know about where you've been recently. So you can say, I'm from Yorkshire because I lived for 3 years in Yorkshire. The English had this in a way because England being a very small island, the English there was very little division within England. In France, until very recently, until the late 19th century, if someone said, who are you? You wouldn't say French. Mm-hmm. You'd say, I'm from Provence, or I'm from Languedoc, or I'm from Brittany. They were regions was much more important. And this was true all over Europe until modern nationalism. It was true in Italy. You wouldn't say, I'm Italian in the 19th century. Mm. You'd say, I'm from Sicily, or wherever it is. So this idea of being from a country is a very recent product in most of the world, but not in England, where from very early on you were wandering around and so you were English. Mm. And there was a uniform language, law, political system, economy, and so you could say, I am English, because it didn't really matter which part you were from.
Mm. I guess because of this recent phenomena of trying to fit yourself within a certain national, within a national identity, I think it begs the question. Well, for me personally, I've always wondered what would be my identity. What is my identity? Because, all right, when I'm in Nigeria, I am Nigerian, but the people there don't treat me as if I'm Nigerian. They say, so in Nigeria we have this term called Oyinbo, and it means, someone from the Anglosphere, and that's what they call me. So they don't quite see me as being Nigerian.
Do you speak Nigerian?
No, I don't speak the language.
Well, it might be different if you did.
I think it would be. It would be. So for me, and being here, I grew up I was the only black person or black guy in my primary school year. So I've always had this, I've always wondered, where do I fit? I kind of felt like a misfit a bit my whole life, not quite being completely aligning with one identity. And so it's always been a very big question for me, where do I fit? And I feel like I haven't quite fit in either
well, that's
side.
Now the condition of most people in the world. Mm. And once you realize that that's the situation you're in, you don't exactly fit in any thing, then you relax and say, well, I don't actually fit in anything, and that there are many advantages to this position. You don't have to completely be one or anything else. And this takes me, or inside or outside, this takes me on to a feature of the way I think we can improve how the world works, which is that looking at the history of my civilization, that is Europe and particularly England, we have always tended to think more and more in a binary way. You are a member of this group or you're not a member of that group. You're for us or against us and so on. And so we have an oppositional form of thinking, binary logic, which you find in computer codes, 1 or 0, it switches back and forth. Now that way of thinking is deeply embedded in our philosophy and our social relations from the Greeks onwards. Their logic excluded the middle. You could not have something. You either had A or you had B. You couldn't have A, half B. And that binary thinking is built into our religion, Christianity, the devil and God, or heaven and hell, or sin or salvation. All of Christianity is based on black and white oppositions. And our legal system, you're guilty or you're not guilty. In our science and thought, it's true or it's false. Everything is binary. Mm. And you see the effects of this in our wars. You're either for us or against us. You're French or the English. You fight. And America is deeply embedded, even more than the English, in binary logic, and that is working out now to the destruction of America. Now, when you go to Asia, starting perhaps in the Middle East even, but certainly when you get to India, and then particularly China and Japan and Far East, they don't have that idea of binary logic at all. They think in quantum logic. It's much easier for us now to understand it because in the 1920s, 30s, physics in our country switched from binary, the scientific Newtonian Einstein theory that things either are this or that. It switched a lot of it at the micro level to quantum thought, which says, in the most famous example, which is sort of visible example everyone knows of probably, Schrödinger, he says when you open the box and see a cat in there, is it alive or is it dead? Mm. And it depends. You open the box one day and it's dead, and the next day it's alive. The cat is both alive and dead, and the movement of the particles, which you can't predict, can go either into that or into that. So once you start to look at Chinese logic, which I know a little bit about, the yin-yang symbol, yin female contains a bit of maleness. The black, which is the female, contains a little pocket of whiteness, and the other side has a little of the other. So males are a little female. And the symbol is not a line, it's like that, which means they need each other. They are complementary. And in the yin-yang system, it moves round, so you become more yin or yang as you move round the cycle. So everything is shifting and cyclical and both and. So the philosophy is both this and that. Humans are both separate from nature and part of nature. Mm. We are both of this world and of another world. Everything is together. We are both family and related to other people who are not family. Now, once you start thinking in that way, it softens the oppositions between all sorts of things, and it makes for a much more peaceful world of coexistence. The current international order is a complete and disaster, and the only solution to that is going to be to move towards the Chinese vision of it, which is that we all are together in this situation. Mm. Now, you might complain that they want to be slightly higher in this solution or not, but basically they don't see themselves in opposition. And the Chinese have never seen themselves in opposition to anyone. The Han are not in opposition to the minorities. China is not in opposition to the countries around it. It is in a brotherly relationship.
Mm-hmm. Where does this quantum logic comes from in China? What is the basis of it? Because you said in the West it's sort of derived from its Judeo-Christian and background. So what is it in China?
Well, in the West it's derived from these two sources, the Greek logic and Judeo-Christian monotheism. All monotheisms are binary. You are either us or you're not us. So the three monotheisms of the West are based on binary thinking. China has no monotheism. It has no God. There's no word for religion in China. There is no God. There is a vague thing called heaven, Tian, but there's no God. And therefore, there was no creator who made this world. There's no story of the Garden of Eden. There's no creation of humans and animals as separate things. So you're dealing in China today with not only the language, which we see around us, but also the philosophies dating back to 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years ago. So you're dealing now in China with ideas that were current in very small settler farmer communities along the Yellow River when they first domesticated plants and animals and set up little villages and so on, where they were animists, what anthropologists call animists. That means the spirit or anime is in nature. There is no separation between the natural world and the human world. They are all interfused. We are part of nature. And that nature religion, which is what you find in Japan with Shinto, or in China with Taoism, the Tao, is still there. It's the dominant way of thinking in China, Taoism. Still, there are things on top of it, Buddhism, Confucianism, but they are Taoists. And so it hasn't changed. The point of origin of China is these animist beliefs, very similar to the ones I saw in Nepal, because they came down from northern China to that area where I worked in the villages. So this ancient tradition of philosophy is still there. Our ancient tradition of philosophy, which partly comes from the Greeks and partly from the accidental discovery of God by Abraham or whoever, invention of a single God, those two streams have now come together in the world from very different origins.
Mm. Yeah, it's very, very interesting kind of ideas as how kind of these two different worlds have developed their own sort of visions or frameworks to kind of see and perceive things. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is that you said the Chinese had no national identity, or perhaps I misinterpreted you, but...
There's not a national identity. It depends how you define national identity. If you said to a Chinese, what is your national identity? Now, recently under the effect of Western nationalism, there is more and more consciousness. You have a passport with, I am Chinese and so on. Until very recently, until, say, the end of the Qing Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, local identities were much, much more important. There were different languages, the Cantonese in the south, Mandarin in the north, and then so your hometown, your village, your wherever you came from was more important. And also the Han, it wasn't really an identity. You were Han, yes, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, really. Mm. It means probably that you have learnt Mandarin and you can write in your language and that you obey the emperor. That's about it. Nothing more. And it's very flexible. One of the things that surprised me when I asked people what they were in China, many of them would say, well, and then they would name some minority. I'm Dai or Miao or something. I'd say, well, what were your parents? And they say, well, my father was Han and my mother was Miao. And I was asked what I wanted to be. And I knew that minorities got preferential treatment at university and in other ways. I thought, well, I'll be Miao. Mm. And you just switch around between them. And there's never been any attempt at forcing anyone to be Han. The Han spread through the adjacent areas. They started along these river valleys, the two river valleys, and they conquered China by moving in, settling, being good farmers, being good businessmen. People married into them, decided they wanted to be like the Han. And within, for example, in the northern part in Manchuria, it took about 100 years for the Han to replace Manchu as the language, replace the Manchurian identities to a large extent, and everyone became Han. And this is happening now in Tibet and other places. You learn the language, you see the advantages of civilization, and you absorb. So it's a kind of absorbing kind of civilization, very different from the Anglo-Saxon or Western imperial tradition where you go out there and you either force them to try and be French. Tunisia and North Africa is a very good example. The French Empire is, it's may interest you. The French and the British empires are totally different. The French Empire is based on blood and family and religion, and it's based on cultural empire. So when you go to Vietnam or Morocco or Tunisia, the deal is you become French, but that means, so you can come without a passport and be French, but you have to be French. You have to learn French as a language. You have to eat French food if possible, French wine. French culture and history is important to you. And as a friend of mine used to joke, across the whole French Empire at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the first lesson in every school from Vietnam to France to Morocco the first lesson started with nos ancêtres les Gauls. So little Vietnamese, Cambodians and others, their ancestors were the Gauls. Now, so you're culturally assimilated, which is great for a while, but now that leads to all the troubles in France because they don't want people who are from these places who say, well, the deal was we could come and because they don't feel French in the proper way. Now, the British Empire was based on an entirely different idea. We don't want you to be British. We just want you to be part of our club. And as members of our club, you get certain benefits. You get peace, order, judicial system, railways, some wealth and protection and so on. You don't have to be British. In fact, please don't. Carry on with your curry eating, your Hinduism, your local languages, your marriage customs and so on, as long as they're tolerable. So culturally you remain whatever you are, but legally, politically and economically you are integrated into the British Empire and you have no right to come here, but you do have a right to leave the club. And one of the miracles of the modern world was the collapse of the British Empire, more or less peacefully without Algeria and so on, or Vietnam, because the British said, you're members of our club, but when you grow up, it was like a public school, you go in there and for a while you are children and so on. When you leave the school, you are an adult. When you become able to run your own show, then you have the right to say, clear off, which the Indians and the Africans did. We don't have any right to hold on to you. Whereas in the French case, using another metaphor, the French thought of their empire as a body. So Algeria or Morocco or Vietnam were parts. They were their arms or legs or whatever. In England, they are other members of the team. So if someone wants to leave your cricket club, good luck to them. And those are two entirely different patterns. The Chinese are much more like the French. And this is what causes a lot of Western misunderstanding. When the West says, well, why don't you just let Hong Kong or Taiwan clear off? For the Chinese, these are part of their body. If you cut off Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, you're not just sort of letting them clear off like the British might do to the Scots. They have a referendum, they can go where they like. And the Chinese are amazed that we allow the Scots to have a referendum because it's like you're letting your hand have a referendum. You can't cut it off. It's an organic whole. And so that's what continental, not just the French, Spanish, Portuguese, they're Catholic. The empire is Catholic, it speaks French, it thinks French, it drinks French, and it is French.
And I think it's really interesting because we clearly see the differences now in today's society in France and in Britain. Like in France, everyone is much more, I guess, culturally together. You know, you'll have all these different, you know, people from Congo, Senegal, you know, Algeria, Morocco, but they still kind of feel French, you know? And as you mentioned, in France, they have this thing where now it's pushing back and the, you know, I guess original people don't like it. But there is this sense that, you know, you might come from somewhere else, but if culturally, you know, you're able to sing Georges Brassens, which is a famous singer, or play the pétanque, you know, you'll be accepted. Well, I feel like here, living in England, it feels like it has created these pockets of different societies, and you see that also in London. You'll see, you know, here the Indians are in this area, and or the Muslims and the Africans here and there, and it's quite divided in a way.
So to give you a counter argument to that, I do feel there hasn't been a more successful society or nation that has kind of absorbed all these different cultures than the British. I think they've done an amazing job of being a diverse society. And I think it's because they're not very overbearing, they're extremely tolerant. And that's perhaps, for me, been the reason why it's been the most successful multicultural.
Well, they treat the British in the same way as those in England, as they did their empire. In other words, if you want to have Chinatown or the Gurung area and you want to eat your food and go to your local mosques and so on, if you want to wear a hijab, then wear a hijab. If you're a Sikh and you have to wear a dagger or a turban instead of a crash helmet, that's your religion, that's your culture, that's up to you. We don't prescribe what gods you believe in and what your culture is. And so you can relax within your culture, but you can be within this larger, because the rules of the game, in other words, law, politics, economics, those formal rules we share. You know, you must pay your taxes and you must drive on the left-hand side of the road and so on. The rules in that sphere are uniform, but the cultural aspects of your life are your own business. Whereas in France, famously in clothing, the French try and, force Muslim women to wear bikinis and the rest of it, nonsense, or hijabs or whatever. So they try and force cultural conformity on people. It has the benefit of not having Chinatowns and so on, perhaps extreme. But for us, the diversity is one of the wonders of the country, and I agree. Perhaps because I was born in India, I'm more or less color and race blind. Likewise with Judaism, for 50 years, my first two girlfriends were Jewish, and it was not until many years later that I realized they were Jewish. It didn't matter. It doesn't matter what the color of a person is. It's the person, the character that matters. So I don't think of you as anything different from myself at all. And many people in this country are like that. It is very tolerant, but it's not a melting pot. And this is one of the big mistakes of 20th century sociology. It was believed that, particularly America, when people came into America, they would melt into some conformity. But more and more it became obvious, and is obvious now, that America, being part of this Anglosphere tradition, is an assembly of many, many different subgroups who have maintained and retained their different languages. To give you an example, I have a friend with whom I've written a book who was a headmaster of a North London school, or many schools. And he said there were 70 or 80 languages spoken in his school in the corridors. But when they went into the classroom, they read Shakespeare or whatever it is they're learning, and they abide by the rules of the classroom. When they go out into the corridors, they are their own culture.
How is it different in China? And I want to ask you, we talked about a little bit that there's this, East and West divide. I mean, we see this in Asia and also in Japan, Korea. Like there's not this melting pot of cultures. Maybe that has to do with the fact that they didn't have this, colonial history. But it still seems like this is something that they don't want. So, what is the difference between East and West? Is will the East become more like the West, or will the West become more like the East?
Well, I think your premise is that, which is right, that they haven't got an imperial history, and therefore you don't see black people in China, except in one or two of the cities, or people from other cultures. You don't even see many Westerners, white people, in my travels. So they aren't used to a multi-ethnic community. But when they do go there, there was some trouble in Shanghai, I think, of people from Africa, because they were behaving in ways which the Chinese thought were inappropriate with women, and so on and so on. But on the whole, one of the great breakthroughs was when African leaders went to China in about 2008 or sometime like around then. And instead of being treated in a racist and patronizing way, which they were when they came to Western countries, the Chinese said, okay, you are our brothers. You're not inferior in any way. We will work with you. And that's why they've worked successfully across the Middle East and in Africa and so on. They might think of them as less educated, perhaps, or needing technological sophistication, but they don't. There's no racism at all in China, and they're very tolerant. They absorb you. This is one of the reasons I love China. When I go to China, and I've got many Chinese friends and students, they absorb you. They don't think you're a Westerner. They do in Japan much more. You're an outsider, and as you found in Nigeria. When we go to China, they obviously know we don't speak Chinese and so on, but there is no feeling of otherness or guardedness or anxiety, or they just say, and very quickly, and this is a miracle that you have in many Asiatic societies, they turn you from a stranger to a family. So they, I am known, my nickname in China among the young is Meng Yeye. Meng means cutie or lovable, and Yeye means grandfather. So in almost all the Chinese families I become involved with, I become a grandfather or an uncle or absorbed into the kinship. And that doesn't just mean, you call someone uncle or whatever. It means you are an uncle. And I discovered this in Nepal, that when I became adopted into one or two Nepalese families, I was their family. So, for example, when my adopted mother and father died, and sister, I had to go to the funeral. I had to light the funeral pyre. I had to worship to the ancestors. I became blood with these people through living there and becoming their family. And that's something that you find across China, that there is no sense of alienation or hostility at all. I mean, I've been 20 times to China, all around, remote villages, big cities. Not once in those 2 or 3 years that I've been traveling in China have I seen a sign of any hostility. No one pointing, no one moving away, no one shouting, no one. And I've been with Chinese speakers, and they might well say, well, that person doesn't like you, or you keep away from. Nothing.
How long did you live in Nepal?
Well, I lived for 15 months on the first instance, and then I went back 15 years later. And after that, I went every year for about 15, 16 years. I've been 20 times over a period of 55 years. And so in total, it's probably 2.5, 3 years, but it's usually 1 month here, 1 month there. And once you've been to a place twice, the first time they think, well, this may be ghosts from abroad. But if you go back to Nepal or China or Japan, the second time they say, yeah, we remember you were here there. You're here now. You're a human being. And from then on, you become deeply enmeshed in that society, which is a huge privilege because you can become very isolated and very Eurocentric and ethnocentric and British-centric. And so constantly, my wife and I have made an effort every year to go to somewhere very distant and refresh our wonder at our own society and warmth that you feel when you go to these societies.
Is that...
Let's have one more question.
All right. Well,
one more each. Okay.
All right. Because, as we were talking before, you have a great YouTube channel where you've been posting since...
It's the Ayabaya channel.
Yeah. Since almost you're one of the first academics, your videos go back 10, 11 years. And some of your videos are with the Himalayas in the background, which are great. So I just wanted to ask you, like, what did you get? And what are some memorable things from your time in Nepal and these other places?
Well, the most memorable thing, I think, is to become aware of yourself and your own civilization. You can't see yourself if you're just in your own society, and you can't see your own society if you're in the middle of it. When I went to Nepal, the aim of anthropology is to go to the other and learn from the other. And what I learned was that almost everything I'd assumed as natural and God-given and what every sane person in the world would do, because they were just like the British, was nonsense. That there was no God, no single God. There was no concept of sin. That the family was very important. So you questioned everything and expanded your vision of what human beings are. That people who live in another thing was that arrogant historians often think of people in the past as inferior in some way, working or living in a society where technologically it's extremely primitive, economically and technologically. When you talk to people, they were just as clever, just as emotionally complex and interesting, if not more so. A number of the people I met, uneducated people in rural parts of Nepal, are just as clever as the Nobel Prize winners that I meet in Cambridge. There's no difference. It's just that they come from different backgrounds. And so I learned that a lot of history is nonsense. The idea that we have become more emotionally mature or civilized or whatever it is, intelligent, is nonsense. We're like that. So it was a shock to all my basic assumptions and a realization that people around the world are at a deep level, very similar.
Thank you so much, Alan, for having us, and thank you for this conversation.
Did you want a last question? Are you okay?
I think that was a nice way to end it, but it was an absolute honor and privilege to be able to have this discussion with you.
And a privilege for me too. Thank you very much.